am delighted to introduce someone that I have grown to admire very deeply over the past few years, David Shanks, who's the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Classification Office. In fact, this is your final official engagement, right? And is stepping down after the end of his 5-year term now. David was appointed as the CEO of New Zealand's Classification Office in May 2017. It's a statutory agency that's arm's length from the government. It's their sort of independent media regulator. And he's a barrister and solicitor who's worked in the private and public sector. He's been the chief legal officer for the largest government department in New Zealand. He's led major public inquiries. He served as director for a technology service sector private company. He's a parent. He's also taken on some of the hardest decisions that anyone in government will ever take on, and done that with a real sort of philosopher practitioner's attitude to trying to balance rights, the law, and also what's right for our societies. I am delighted to introduce him because he has a passion that I think is infectious and a determination as well that we will all need if we're going to deal with the problems that we face in the coming years.
Kia ora. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, CCDH. Thanks to all of you for being here at such an event, at such a time in history in terms of addressing what I believe are truly fundamental issues for all of us globally. Just to begin, just in the interest of transparency, you'll see in the agenda I'm described as the CEO, and Imran, you've just called me the CEO of the Classification Office, which is true, but actually my official title in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that of Chief Censor. I'm sorry, I know some of you are thinking at this moment, that's the most Hunger Games dystopian title I have ever heard in the free world, and to an extent I'd agree with you, and when I noticed my title wasn't being used in the materials, I understood, but I think I said to you, Eva, am I being cancelled? Because if I am, it's okay, but it's kind of ironic, don't you think? But I understand, because I'll try and hold back on gratuitous or offensive use of the C word, but really it is a dystopian title. But over time, over the past 5 years, I've come to see it as something of a fit for an increasingly dystopian world. And yes, I actually have stood down. I stood down a few days ago. It's a term appointment. My second term came to an end. So I am no longer an official. So I guess that makes this presentation unofficial. And I'll no longer censor anything. So I guess that makes this uncensored. So it is a wonderful opportunity for me to look over 5 extraordinary years doing an absolutely challenging and horrific but important role for the government. And as I and my team waded through the digital sewers of material that were referred to us as a classification authority, one of the key things that kept me and my team going was the realisation that what we were learning in doing this was important. The lessons we could learn, the insights we could gain from doing sometimes this horrendous work could be invaluable in terms of architecting a new framework for addressing these challenges. And I think from everything we've heard here today, the discussions to this point, I think we can all agree a new framework is needed. We need a new approach. These things are serious, very serious issues indeed, potentially threatening our way of life, our democracy, our very society, our cohesion as a society. And unless we grapple with those issues and make serious moves to address these fundamental architectural issues, we are facing a very serious situation indeed. But look, on the censorship thing, I quite agree that censorship is an ugly word. And more, I see around the world instances of state censorship that are abhorrent. I mean, you only need to look over at what is happening in Russia right now, where if you call what is happening in Ukraine a war, as opposed to the special military whatever, if you call that war a war in Russia, you can face imprisonment of up to 10 years. It is completely abhorrent and dreadful use of state power, and that's a slope that no one should be going down. But I would argue there can be a balance. In my job, I never did anything like that. My job required me and my team to make classifications and assess content, videos, recordings, audio, material, written material that was at the extreme end of content, the point where material becomes unlawful. And if you think about that as a job, you can see that whatever you call it, it's going to get ugly. And as many people would say to me, I couldn't do that job. What? How can you do it? And I take that point. Our role was to stare into the abyss. No matter how bad it got, we had to look. When most sane people would look away, we had to look. We had to keep watching. And you can't unsee some of that. And we treated it like we were a professional hazmat removal team. We would have protocols and support and backup to keep ourselves as safe as possible. But who would do such a job? Well, I can tell you some very, very fine, professional, strong people do that job. People who go to work and do a very difficult job to keep their nation, their people, kids safe. And as a father, as I started doing the job, as I started seeing what was there, and I realised that we give our children a smartphone at about the age of 12 on average in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm sure it's something similar here. At that point, when they're connected to the internet with that device, they can access all of that. Everything I was being referred from law enforcement authorities, it's only a few clicks away for a kid. And kids, in my experience, don't go looking for that sort of stuff. Not at first, anyway. It finds them. So these things are serious. 5 years of doing that, this has taught me that we have very fundamental, critical issues that we have to face up to. And in many ways, they're so ugly, it's easier for society and leaders to look away. But I think we are recognising this reality today, and that's important. And of course, one of the most serious and horrific events that I had to deal with occurred on March 15, 2019 in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Now, Imran's already called out the linkages to the Great Replacement theory in that attack, or in the Buffalo attack that has just occurred. And I can say that I know this theory very well. I've encountered it many times in my professional career. And I did have to deal with one of its most brutal manifestations. So, March 15 was a Friday. I can recall on that Friday afternoon having a meeting interrupted with the reports of a dreadful attack occurring in Christchurch. Details were unclear, but it was very clear something utterly horrific had happened. Some kind of event, a mass shooting. And I can distinctly recall getting a phone call from a friend, and I could tell he was quite disturbed, and he told me, "I've just watched it. I've seen this thing on my social media feed." And this is in the immediate hours, maybe an hour after the attack, that I had this news. Now we know now the dreadful truth of what had occurred. 100 people had been gunned down. 51 were dead and 49 were wounded. People were peacefully practicing their religion in Christchurch mosques, exercising their freedom of religion, their freedom of association, their simple right to life. But once I got that call, I realised the horrible truth, that even though the active part of the attack was complete, actually another dreadful phase of this event was just beginning. The live stream of that video was, as I was being told this news, going viral all the way across New Zealand social media across the world. It had been live streamed to Facebook Live. About 200 people had seen it. Some of those had immediately captured it and were uploading it to virtually all social media servers. And so we had another fight, a fight against a horrendous online harm. And so fight we did. In the aftermath, it was clear that the platforms' AIs were essentially going out of control. This material was high engagement material. The AIs saw that anyone who interacted with it would react strongly. They would share it, they would react, they would do something. And this, of course, as we heard, is exactly what the AIs are trained to look for. So what do? They boosted it. So while the digital safety teams and platforms, such as Facebook, but many, many others, were fighting to take this material down, they were trying to fight a fire that their own AIs were pouring petrol on. And also, there were forums. There were forums of support groups for this kind of ideology. And on those forums, there were celebrations. And on those forums, they were discussing how to adjust and adapt and edit the live stream to defeat the hash protection algorithms that the big platforms were putting up. Imagine that. So I needed to view this video as soon as I could, and I did. I received an official copy, and I can recall stealing myself before I viewed it. But I thought, well, I have seen this sort of material before. I dealt with terrorist material, mass attacks, mass killings, but this was different. The live streaming of this attack, taken from the shooter's helmet as he relentlessly and coldly and brutally gunned down those innocent people in my land, forced me to view things from his perspective, took me where he went, everywhere he went. I hadn't seen anything quite like this before. And I was obliged to assess what impact would this have, what sort of harms could it present. Imagine that. So I could see, obviously, imagine if you were a relative of one of these people. Imagine that. Imagine if you're a child, having it recommended to you on a platform, unknowingly, not having any idea what was going on, just seeing this and trying to understand what it is. So those are disturbing harms, I'm sure we can agree, but they're not what I was most concerned about. What I was most concerned about was that very, very small percentage of viewers who would be interested in what they were seeing, who would be curious about it, who would be excited by it. I was very worried about that impact and that audience. So we assessed it formally within a couple of days. We announced that we had made the live stream unlawful under New Zealand law. And within a few days, we also did a further announcement that we had made the associated, I think, 78-page manifesto, so-called manifesto, unlawful under New Zealand law. And we knew we had to get ahead of the communications around this, because normally when we make something that is this in this category, the only people really paying attention to these decisions is law enforcement officers. Most people aren't interested, but this was different because this had gone to so many people, had been so widely discussed. So one of the key things we needed to do was communication. We needed to engage the public and go, look, we understand that this has come to you. You may have even forwarded it on. It was, nobody knew how they're expected to behave in their response to this. We understand that, but what you need to understand now is that this is unlawful. This material is produced by a terrorist to promote terrorism. It is propaganda for death. Don't help it. Don't propel it. If you have it, delete it. If you printed it, destroy it. If you find it, don't share it. Identify it. Report it if you see it. And people understood. It made sense in the aftermath of that horrible event. It certainly wasn't universal. We did have some people eventually go to our board of review about our decisions on both the live stream and the manifesto, arguing that the manifesto, for example, was an example of political free speech. The board of review did not agree. They said, no, this is terrorist promotional propaganda of the most extreme and abhorrent sort. It presents a danger to our society. And what I said to people who spoke to me personally, media and others, going, well, I should have access to this document. I want to see what motivated this attack. And I said to them, I understand that. It's totally understandable to be curious about something like that, but what you need to understand is that this product, this document, is not written for you. It's not about that. It's not about informing you about the reasons. This document is drafted for a very, very specific purpose. In fact, all of this is created for a very, very specific purpose. And that purpose is to activate another killer or other killers. And if you're a journalist, if you're a historian, if you're a writer, if you're a researcher, then by all means, we want you to have access to this material. We want you to write about it. We want you to shed light on it. We want you to analyse it in a way that helps us learn and heal and grow. So the difficult aspect here, as I say, was really the public-facing engagement and discussion, which needed to be had. It was very, very important. And I didn't make the decision lightly. I never made any decision to make any material unlawful lightly. Our freedom of speech is a vital, precious freedom. It's an essential democratic right. But no right is absolute. At the end of the day, we found that these things, they were not protected free speech. They were instructions to kill. It was terror, and we treated it as such. But as we worked through the communications phase, as the reviews worked through, I had an abiding sense of dread, because we continued to watch the forums, we continued to watch the discussion on the internet, we continued to see how the effects of this attack and the sharing of this material rolled on and resonated around the internet. And we could see that effect rolling through the discussions, the appropriation of sainthood of the killer by certain individuals on some forums, the enthusiasm for what had occurred. We saw a game released that turned the attacks essentially into a crude video game where you could just murder innocent people endlessly. And it was sold for $14.88 on the internet. So my deep concern was that the attacker might succeed in what was so obviously his objective in this. And on April 27, 2019, just over a month after these events, a 19-year-old man with an assault rifle attacked a synagogue in Poway, South California, shooting 4 people, killing 1. And he had been spending time in these corners of the internet. He had reportedly released his own document where he set out how the Christchurch killer's writings had been a catalyst for him personally. August the 3rd, just a few months later, a 21-year-old man attacks a Walmart in El Paso. Again, with an assault rifle, he gunned down 46 people, killing 23, reportedly specifically targeting Mexican people. Again, a regular in the same online forums, and he posts his own Great Replacement manifesto 25 minutes before he starts shooting. The first line expresses his support for the Christchurch terrorist. Yet again, 2 months after that, October the 3rd, a 27-year-old neo-Nazi in Halle, Germany, live streams his attack on a synagogue, killing 2 people outside. And only 7 days after that, a 21-year-old man in Bærum, Norway, shoots his stepsister dead, and then attempts to live stream his attack on the local mosque. Reportedly, he saw himself as a disciple of the Christchurch terrorist. So you might be able to imagine this was a horrific sequence of events for me, given the concerns that I had right at the outset when I first saw this material and read the Christchurch Killer's manifesto and saw his malignant intent. And of course, my professional obligation meant that I had to watch any and all material from these attacks. I had to read these neo-Nazi screeds. And that was painful. But one of the things that helped me work through that was the realization that any pain that I felt was as nothing compared to the pain felt by the child experiencing a bullet striking their flesh. It was insignificant compared to the pain of a father asking his mother why, of a son asking his mother why his father will not be coming home. This will not stand. And a few days ago, retired from classification, in a hotel room in Canada, I see an early report of an attack in Buffalo, and I find myself dropping into the same mode that I had with my responsibility as a regulator and a warner and a classification officer for the New Zealand government system. I felt the ground drop away, and I found myself going to the same places, checking the same reports, and pretty soon I was watching another recording of a young white male with an assault rifle killing innocent people. As we know now, broadcasting the murder of 11 and the wounding of 2 more innocent, peaceful people going about their business, doing their shopping, exercising their rights. People targeted simply because of the colour of their skin. And I found myself reading another rambling white supremacist manifesto, 180 pages long, much of which I had seen and read before, but with some notable aspects that struck to my heart, where the document describes a bored teen going through a message board and stopping at a GIF, seeing a man firing a weapon down a darkened hallway and being curious and searching and finding the Christchurch live stream video. And then the manifesto says that live stream started everything you see here. So this does have to stop. It will not stand. And my experience is the pain and grief and appreciation of awfulness of these events does provide an opportunity to look this in the face and think through what can be done. And there were things done post the attacks in Christchurch. Not perfect, but meaningful. The Christchurch Core was put in place. An innovative governmental and industry coalition aimed at preventing violent extremism and terrorism online, aimed at preventing the internet from being weaponised in the way that we've seen. An important, but as we have seen, not yet completely effective response. But America is part of that coalition now, and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism is also putting in place methods and modes to identify and share hashes to take down material quicker. How has that worked? How has that worked? In my observation, there has been actually significant improvements. In some of the attacks that I was talking about in 2019, I could see some of these mechanisms operating to reduce and moderate the flow and proliferation of this sort of content. How has it worked in the last few days? Not great, right? Certainly not perfect. Maybe it would have been much worse without the safeguards that have been put in place. But we don't know, because part of the problem here is this system is information asymmetric. Transparency is a critical part of the response strategy, and absolutely that has to be key. In all of my time in responding to these issues, it was absolutely key to me and clear to me that these digital platforms knew far, far more about what was going on in their platforms, their recommendations, how the algorithms were feeding people this sort of extremist material. Far, far more than I could ever know. That asymmetry is fundamental. So, we are moving to a solutions panel shortly, and I had a number of solutions in mind that I was going to talk briefly about, but actually, perhaps we could just move to the panel. There's a couple of things that I want to pick up on that we've gone through, though. This is about having an industry duty of care that works, right? There is no duty of care in place for digital platforms, for social media, for the tech industry that's working. And why is that? Well, if you think about traditional industries, the duty of care is established by regulation and lawful requirements, public liability, lawsuits, as we've heard about, and public expectation. Those are the three main areas that form the standard of care bar for an industry. And where are we at with regulation? Things are moving, right? But we effectively don't have regulation in place, as we've heard and talked about. How about public liability? I was going to talk about Section 30 briefly, but I think we've had a good exposition on that from the previous panel. The reality is we need to do an intelligent reform of Section 230. Section 230 is a 1996 piece of legislation. The internet, as comprehended by lawmakers then, bears no resemblance to what we're dealing with now and the risks and challenges that we see. We absolutely need to be looking at that. And in terms of public expectation, nobody knows what to expect of these platforms. I mean, essentially, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And products don't have many rights. If you go and complain about content or a harm on the internet to one of these big platforms, see how far you get as an individual. And yet there's no shared expectation across communities about how to join up and set a public expectation. And that's where civil society and communities are absolutely key and important to drive that aspect of a joined up duty of care or standard of care. How are we going for time? Couple of minutes. Perfect. So, look, I think we've been here before. I mean, I imagine what it was like back in the 1920s when the oil and coal exploitation industries were just ramping up, right? We had cars and trucks revolutionising transport. Power was cheap. Oil barons made unbelievable fortunes. Life was good. The whole time we were pumping about 1 trillion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere that now we don't know what to do with. Go forward 100 years to now. Look at where we're at with digital industry. The internet has revolutionised access to information. Data is cheap. Digital barons are making unbelievable fortunes. Meanwhile, we're in the process of generating an uncountable number of bits, flecks of misinformation, of hatred, of violent extremism that's filling up our digital ecosystem. What sort of issue are we producing for our future? And if you go back 100 years ago and look at that industry and imagine some small changes that could be made in the operating parameters and the regulation of that industry, we could be looking at an entirely different world and new future ahead of us for insignificant hints on the overall profitability of that business. Couldn't we perhaps be in a similar situation now, here, with respect to digital industry? And I think it's our duty to do that, to engage in exactly that, to put a standard of care in place for these industries that works for people, not for industry, not for government, for we the people. It's essential that we do that. It won't be easy, it will be hard, it will be expensive. But one thing the digital industry has is plenty of money. Thank you.